All right, we're in the home stretch. So for this last week, we're doing Korean cinema. This brings us up to date. Even before all of the hubbub with Parasite, I tend to end film history and international cinema with South Korea because it's particular and even peculiar in the sense that it's one of the only national cinemas that's sort of thriving, and not only just thriving domestically in the way that India is, but this kind of really almost abnormal success that you don't really see anymore internationally, because as we know, a lot of this semester has been about really the U.S. and the specter of the U.S. It's always in the background. Hollywood is always, behind the corner, just sort of waiting in the wings. And all of these disparate movements were kind of moments. And to be honest, even Korean cinema can be considered a moment. In fact, for my money, and I get this from a lot of the scholars that I read, is that the real moment where Korean cinema is actually doing something really interesting, so something akin to a movement that taking off someone like Darcy Paquet and someone from like Julian Stringer and Chi Shin, is the idea of new Korean cinema, different from the Korean New Wave, is very, very brief. And so I'm also of the mind, following someone like Steve Cho, following someone like Jo Jun, that Korean cinema is basically interesting from like 2000 to 2008. So one might ask, well, 12 years, after 2008, when in 2020 with Parasite and with Burning last year, like how can you say that with The Wailing, a few years ago? Well, that's a perfect sort of, contemporary, current moment example of the sort of messiness of periodization. That there were French New Wave films far after the sort of official or even unofficial kind of designation of the years in which that movement sort of was actually going on, or any of these movements. I mean, history is arbitrarily determined by people. The designations. There isn't a clean break or clean start for that matter, and some might argue that Korean cinema has been interesting for 20 years. Some might argue that Korean cinema has been interesting since, the World War, or the Korean War, since 1951. Like we could play that game all day, and really it just comes down to, what's the kind of designation that we agree with, and the one that I agree with is the one that it was interesting, and it's already sort of petered off. And the sort of really exciting Korean cinema that really got people's attention has already kind of faded. And so it's not to say that it's not exciting that something like Burning or something like Parasite is getting all the attention it does. But I am absolutely of the mindset, and we'll talk about this in the second class, that Parasite is not the most exciting Korean film to come out in the last 20 years. It's not even the best, Bong's best work. I don't even think it's like Bong's second or third best work, to be frank. And we'll talk about that, I mean, that's the question. That is one of the major questions. It's like, why this film? Why not that film? And that's partially why I want you all, especially when you're studying cinema, to get away from a framework of judgment and value judgment and hierarchizing, because it's not the criteria. So I'm struggling because I don't want to say it's subjective objective. So one version of this is that the criteria to determine what makes a good film is not objective, right? It's subjective. But that's anyone can say that. Everyone says that when it behooves them, right? So if someone tells me Parasite is the best film, I could just as easily say, well, that taste is subjective, man. But the problem is that then I would, turn around, the same person turn around and say, but actually The Wailing is a better film and that's objective. And that doesn't work that way. So the better framework is one that's kind of been, just like the US, here in front of us the entire time. It's historical, ahistorical. Criteria are historical, meaning they're determined in a distinct period by distinct people. They're not something that remain unchanged, like the fact that humans need air to live, right, and water, right. That is something that's objective. What makes a good film is not objective. So we can't treat it in the same sort of way. We have to treat it as something that's contingent, that changes, and so that's why you have to kind of be suspicious of your own impulses. Because, again, the kind of more rudimentary version of this is that what you think is good and bad is subjective, but the more sophisticated thought is that it's not just that it's subjective, it's that it's historical. That it's even further outside than the individual, sort of differences, but rather like entails something as broadly as, just basically everything, like your relationship to the world and history. And so in that sense, to kind of understand that as quickly as possible is to be able to occupy the sort of critical space where you're not kind of indulging the idea that Parasite and the Academy Awards is objectively, the metric of value, as opposed to the Academy Awards in the 1950s, but rather that, to be kind of analytical, to have the sort of space to be analytical about both Parasite, also Gone with the Wind, also The Host, so that it's outside of these kind of judgmental frameworks. So this is also, I also just want to use this opportunity, we're rounding the home stretch, so I kind of have to get everything I need to say on tape, as it were. But also, like, for those of you who will be continuing, I know that some of you already know and are signed up, but I will be teaching just contemporary Korean cinema next semester. And those of you who will be leaving us, of course, that does not mean that you can't participate. You can always stay in touch with us, and whether it's readings or films. But that's partially what I would like to say, is that that offer is much more meaningful in as much as the kind of conversations and discussions that we can kind of offer and provide. What I'm trying to say is that when you leave academia and you leave college, it's easy to get recommendations of films. It's much more harder to get recommendations of the sort of readings and things and ideas that we've been talking about. But that's all on the table, basically. Okay, so just to kind of go into the key points very quickly. So we're talking about Darcy Paquet's chapter, The Boom. This is the third chapter that really talks about, so we're kind of skipping over the sort of history up to the point, but when, in the early 21st century, when Korean cinema actually kind of explodes, the larger context of that. And this is from his book, New Korean Cinema, Breaking the Waves, 2009 book. It's a great book, it's very informative, kind of does exactly what you need it to do, and you have a really great handle on the sort of history of Korean cinema and tendencies once you've had this book. But there are three kind of main points. One is the financial crisis, and sort of critical to understanding Asian cinema, Korean cinema, recent Korean, South Korean history, is the 1997 financial crisis. Now to us, I think this makes sense in a way that, for anyone who's interested in the state of things, you have to understand the 2008 housing collapse. But let's say in 2007, this wouldn't resonate as much, that kind of need to think about socioeconomic collapse. Two is the significance of the screen quota, which I've mentioned before. And then finally is the idea of blockbuster as moving target. And I didn't plan this deliberately, but now putting them up on the board, it just made me realize, between the three of them, well, for one, we wouldn't have been able to kind of hit these points on day one of the class. But by now, we know how to kind of approach film history and film in general, that this makes sense to us, or it doesn't seem at least as alien and strange. But between the three of them, it kind of demonstrates a lot of the key points that we've been trying to sort of really hit hard this semester, in the sense that, one, the kind of relate that, like, studying, you know, media and culture and cinema and art is not some sort of isolated, kind of contained experience where you can only look at the film and think about the film. Like, know that it has not just like a contextual relationship, but a deep, deep relationship to the sort of conditions that produced it, right? The financial crisis. In fact, just to give you a quick example, I started watching a not very great Korean film on Netflix last night, Time to Hunt. And even though it's a science fiction film, even though it's a 2020 film, 23 years removed, the film keeps talking about the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. 20 years after the financial crisis. In South Korea, the 1997 financial crisis is called the IMF crisis. So that catastrophe is so large that it continues to inform, Korean culture and history. No different from, 9/11. 9/11 was 20 years ago, but it's like, see, when it's like something that's really, really familiar and personal and intimate to us, it's easy to say, like, oh yeah, of course, 20 years, but when it's someone else's, business, like, you're still talking about this 20 years later. It's very easy to kind of do that sort of flip-flopping, and that's really what this entire semester has been about, is simultaneously being able to think about the other as if, it's my own sort of life, and vice versa, to have the same sort of, like, kind of objective step back, so that it's not so personal, so it's not so raw, so it's not so intimate. The screen quota gets us to both the role of the state and governmentality in terms of cinema, and how it's not just some sort of, like, utopia where artists are kind of, doing their thing, and romantically kind of, living this bohemian lifestyle and just producing art, but rather that there are deep, deep negotiations that must be made. And more importantly, how something like cinema is related to global geopolitics, and especially, trade, like in this case, neoliberal trade, free trade, right? The screen quota is entirely a sticking point between South Korea and the US in a very, very direct way, and not just in terms of cinema, but in terms of global trade. So it's a sticking point between two governments. It's not just like, we're making art out here, man, we're trying to make people happy. It's like, no, it becomes like something that's on the negotiation table, right? And then finally, the idea of the moving target precisely goes back to this idea that I was just talking about in terms of things being historical, that it's not as if, so this is in terms of Julian Stringer talking about blockbusters as moving targets. A definition or a category is not, even though it's like oftentimes legally determined, so there are like laws and guidelines as to what you can call organic, for example. But then there are other things, that other categories and buzzwords that the FDA doesn't regulate, something like natural. So a corporation can come up with whatever it wants when they say natural, and and then the consumers will think whatever they want, and the corporations, the food companies will allow us to think for whatever they want. But if you want something like organic, there are a series of regulations and rules that you have to sort of abide by. So that seems to be something that's objective, rational, scientific, universal, right? Just the way that like 1 + 1 = 2, or hydrogen plus oxygen equals, water. But it's not, because it's historical. What counts as organic today will not count as organic tomorrow. We didn't even have the organic determination 50 years ago, 100 years ago. It's all historical. So this really emphasizes that dimension to studying things, is that you can't treat these things as stable, concrete, knowable, mappable, reliable, these things always change. Whether it's organic, whether it's blockbuster, whether it's authentic, you know, whether it's irony, whether it's good or whether it's bad, whether it's art, whether it's commerce, you know. And so, because these things are constantly moving targets, this is why I constantly talk about, like, if you're a deep, engaged, rigorous, critical thinker, you have to have dexterity. You have to have flexibility, adaptability, you have to be nimble. You have to be able to move, you know, along with the moving target. You can't just sit here and just, you know, insist on, well, this is what that means. Meanwhile, it's changing right in front of you and passing you by. Again, you know, a lot of you play club sports. Same thing, is that, like, you know, whatever sports you play, you can't just, you know, stay in your position like this. Like, even if you're, you know, like playing baseball or softball, it's like you can't just be in the outfield just like this, and then, like, balls coming over here, balls coming over there. Like, you have to move with it. That's what all of this has been about in some sense. You can't just keep insisting, you know, I don't know, whatever kind of, like, given slogan that people like to sort of harp on about. So that was kind of a lengthier introduction, but kind of give you a sense of where we're going today. So let's get into the actual reading.